House File 2235 is a bill that directs the State Board of Education to adopt rules to establish the new statewide assessment as the next generation Iowa assessments. The test recently developed by the Iowa Testing Program at the University of Iowa and the successor to the Iowa assessments. With that, Mr. President, there is an amendment.
There is an amendment. The chair calls up Amendment 5136. The chair recognizes the senator from Muscatine, Senator Lofgren, for opening remarks on Amendment 5136.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate. Amendment 5136. This amendment provides certain boundaries for what the assessment is to include. Specifically, the amendment does 5 things. First, the amendment requires the new assessment for English language arts, which includes reading and writing, math and science assessments to be ready for the July 1, 2018 school year. Second, the amendment requires the new assessment to be assigned with the Iowa Common Core standards in both content and rigor and provide a measure for student growth and meet the summative assessment requirements of ESSA. Next, the amendment states the new assessment is to be available in both paper and computer-based format. The amendment also requires an independent third-party review to determine that the assessment is aligned, measures student growth, and meets assessment requirements of ESSA. Finally, the amendment allows Iowa Testing Service to make any adjustments needed if the review determines that the changes are needed. Mr. President, those are my opening remarks.
Is there discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, the chair recognizes the senator from Muscatine for final remarks on Amendment 5136.
I'd just like to move the amendment.
The senator from Muscatine moves the adoption of Amendment 5136 to House File 2235. A record roll call vote has been requested. The secretary will open the voting system and receive your vote. Senator Edler votes aye. Senator C. Johnson votes aye. Senator Guth votes aye. Senator Chapman votes aye. Senator Schneider votes aye. Senator Costello votes aye. Senator Schultz votes aye. Senator Zahn votes aye. Senator Carlin votes aye. As every senator voted, every senator has voted. The secretary will close the voting system. Secretary will lock the voting system and receive your votes. The Senate will pay Senate will pay attention to the record roll call. Those voting aye, 49. Those voting no, 0. The bill having received a constitutional majority is declared to have passed the Senate, and the title was agreed to. We're now back on House File 2235 as amended. Is there further discussion? The chair recognizes the senator from Story, Senator Kornbach.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I rise in opposition to this bill. Let's start with a little history, a little of the disgraceful history of this issue. About 5 years ago, the legislature set up a task force to recommend a new assessment for our K-12 students. The task force had 21 members, stakeholders from every area of education. They worked without pay for a whole year. In the end, they came to a remarkable consensus. 20 of 21 agreed to the task force recommendation. The Iowa Department of Education started to implement, but a year ago, December, Governor Branstad put on the brakes for no particularly clear substantive reason. So last year, we started over from scratch. Never mind all the work that had been put in by the 21 volunteers plus staff. In Senate File 240, we mandated a new RFP, that is request for proposal process, for a new test selection. That process went forward, evaluating 7 proposals on the 7 criteria in Senate File 240. The winning proposal came from the American Institutes for Research, or AIR. A losing proposer, the Pearson Group, working with Iowa Testing, challenged the award, but an administrative law judge validated that the award process, as overseen by the Department of Administrative Services, had followed accepted state procedure. Nevertheless, this bill comes forward to award the assessment to the losing proposer, Pearson. This is a shameful history. It disrespects the law. It disrespects the educators and other stakeholders who volunteered their time and talents. It disrespects any concept of orderly, rational, objective policy making. It has been a disgrace. Interestingly, when I made these remarks in the Education Committee, a number of people piped up and agreed that with this description of the process. Then they voted for the bill, seemingly oblivious to the fact that this bill is itself Act 2 of this farce. How does the losing Pearson proposal compare with the winning AIR proposal? In all 7 of the statutory criteria, AIR came out on top. In 6 of the 7, the margin was between 10 and 20 points on the 100-point scale that was used. Most telling was the aligned with Iowa's academic standards criterion. What this means is simply this: does the test measure what Iowa kids are being taught? By a margin of 70 points to 50, AIR beat Pearson. The reason is simple. AIR's test has been independently validated as aligning with Iowa's state curriculum standards. The Pearson test has not yet gone through such an independent validation. Why the Iowa testing assessment is still not aligned more than 5 years into this process is a continuing mystery to me. Now, why is alignment critical? Because it's unfair to test kids on stuff they haven't been taught. Because it's unfair to our teachers and our schools to do that, because it fails to give them the credit they deserve for their hard work teaching the rigorous and relevant curriculum that we, the legislature, has mandated. A week and a half ago, I met with the school superintendents in Story County, and they were quite insistent on this point. And Senator Bain, I might note, the superintendent from Boone was also there. The only substantive advantage of the Pearson test is it costs $5 less per student. That's $5 out of the $6,700 per student per year we spend in the state cost per pupil, or the roughly $10,000 that we spend in total on each student each year. $5. That's a small price to pay for a test that does measure what students have learned, as opposed to one that does not yet do so. Well, what do we risk from this bill? Well, beyond the damage to our kids and our schools, there's a fair amount of federal money involved. The Iowa Department of Education has received a letter from the United States Department of Education identifying several areas in which Iowa's current assessments fall short of the standards needed to continue Iowa's access to federal funds. And let me read a little bit from that lengthy letter. This is from an Ann Whalen, who is executing the duties of the Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education, U.S. Department of Education. It's addressed to the Honorable Ryan Weiss, Director of the Iowa Department of Education. She writes in part, I am writing to provide you feedback on your state's recent submission of evidence. External peer reviewers and department staff evaluated the Iowa Department of Education submission and found, based on the evidence received, that the components of your assessment system met some, but not all, of the statutory and regulatory requirements of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Based on the recommendations from this peer review and our own analysis of the state submission, I have determined the following. Reading and Language Arts, Mathematics, General Assessment grades 3 through 8 partially meets requirements. Reading and Language Arts and General Assessments in high school partially meets requirements. Science General Assessment grades 5 and 8 partially meets requirements. Science General Assessment in high school partially meets requirements. She continues, the components that partially meet requirements do not meet a number of requirements of the statute and regulations, and Iowa Department of Education will need to provide substantial additional information to demonstrate it meets the requirements. And later, because some of the state's components have partially met the requirements, the department, that is the federal department, is placing a condition on the state's Title I grant award related to those components of the assessment system. And further, insufficient progress to address such matters may lead the federal department to place a condition on Iowa Department of Education's IDEA Part B grant award. I'm informed by a person who used to be our Department of Education's assessment consultant that the amount of money involved could be as much as $112 million. $112 million is the downside risk here. I've also heard it said that we should go ahead with this bill because we wouldn't want the decision to be tied up for years in litigation. The actual risk is the opposite. If anyone has grounds for a lawsuit, it's AIR. They won the RFP process, and the validity of that process has been upheld by an administrative law judge. The AIR assessment is aligned, and the assessment preemptively chosen by this bill does not yet do so. If the goal is to avoid a lawsuit, we should vote down this bill and let the RFP award stand. The amendment just adopted is itself evidence of the sloppy procedure in formulating this bill. So little concern was there for alignment, for being fair to kids by making sure that they were being tested on what they had actually been taught, that the House forgot to include language requiring such alignment. It is only here today, so very late in the game, that we are inserting an alignment requirement, almost as an afterthought. The amended bill exhibits a fascinating internal tension. With the amendment, it now specifies the grounds on which a winner is to be chosen, but the bill also explicitly chooses a winner, notwithstanding the fact that the Pearson assessment has yet to demonstrate it satisfies the criterion for winning. What if after evaluation it fails? What then? This time of year we have two basketball tournaments called March Madness. People have a lot of fun with seedings and rankings and brackets, but in the end, to be champ, you have to win the games. That's not true here in our version of educational March Madness. According to this bill, you can lose the game and still be picked champion if you have enough friends in the legislature. Now, I would have been very pleased if the Iowa testing folks had come out on top. Really, I would have. To conduct a wide-open, nationwide, objective process on the merits of assessment and to find that the very best in the country was our own homegrown product would have been a great source of pride to our whole state. But that didn't happen. Somebody else won. There are some who would say, forget all the time and effort in evaluating assessment. Forget the objective analysis of merit. Let's go with the home folks. Well, then why stop with assessments? Why don't we require that all textbooks used have to be published in Iowa? Maybe Meredith could go into the textbook publishing business. I don't know, maybe they already are. And why stop there? Why not require all our university faculty to be born in Iowa? That knocks me out. I was born in a far-off land called Minnesota. You'd probably knock out 90% of the faculty at the University of Iowa, but hey, why not go with the home folks? In fact, let's just build a wall around Iowa and not let any competitors or any new products in. Build a wall around Iowa. I'll bet we could get Missouri to pay for it. I have a better idea. Let's abandon this bill, this fetid confluence of political interference and parochial interest. Let's instead put good government first. Let's put rational, objective decision-making first. Let's put respect for teachers and educational professionals first. Most of all, let's put Iowa kids first. Drop this bill and go with a test that is proven to measure their progress. Let's give them, the kids, the students of Iowa, the credit they deserve, and the teachers the credit they deserve for all the hard work they have put in and all the learning they have achieved. Vote no on this bill. Let the RFP process go forward to conclusion. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes Senator from Polk, Senator McCoy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, I rise in opposition to 2235, and again, for the same reasons that Senator Cornbach has cited in his lengthy explanation of why he's opposed to this bill. You know, Iowa educators have been trying for 7 years to switch to a better statewide test that matches what's being taught in the classroom. Currently, our kids take the Iowa assessment every year in 3rd grade through 11th grade. Because the test doesn't match the curriculum, nor does it measure student growth, it doesn't give teachers and administrators useful information. And therefore, we're measuring kids with a tool that isn't accurately measuring what was actually taught in school. And that's why alignment is so important. Right now, we have more than 130,000 Iowa kids that are taking a duplicate test called the Measure of Academic Progress, or MAP test. And they're doing that because this other test is not available. And they know they need to be measuring student progress. Now the legislature once again is attempting to throw out the educator's choice and designate in code that Iowa is required to use a test from Iowa Tester. I think it is welcoming a lawsuit. There will be a lawsuit because the RFP was accurately scored and the vendor that was selected won on all accounts. And now we're expecting that the University of Iowa is going to develop this test, but we also know that they're going to have to go through peer review, and it's going to take some time, and Iowa kids are going to suffer in the meantime. So ultimately, we have a choice here today, I think, to avoid a lawsuit, to avoid further damaging children in the state of Iowa. And Senator mentioned that the funding for title funding is at risk as it relates to not aligning with the Common Core. The number that I received is we're putting at risk up to $225 million for Iowa schools as a result of that, and as a result of not having this test in place. And the Federal Department of Education is really sanctioning states. In fact, they just sanctioned Idaho by 10% of their federal title funding. And if Iowa had a similar sanction against us, it could result in over $25 million being put at risk as a result of this. Not to mention the court battle that will certainly ensue as the vendor that was selected under very rational criteria will have a case against the state for throwing out their RFP and overriding the process. I wonder why we're doing this bill. Senator Shelgren, would you yield?
Would Senator Shelgren yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
You are in order,
Senator Shelgren, why are we doing this bill?
Why are we doing this bill? Well, clearly there's a House file that came over to us that was almost unanimously supported. I think it was like 95-3. We went through a subcommittee and a committee process. We heard Senator Cornbach's objections to that point, and I want to give a strong compliment to our colleague Senator Lofgren, who worked with a variety of stakeholders to address almost all the concerns I've heard so far in the amendment that we all just voted on unanimously to pass. So that makes this, I assume, address almost all of your concerns at this point. If there's additional concerns that the amendment didn't address, I'd be more than happy to address those directly.
Senator Shelgren, have you sought any legal advice as it related to the RFP process, or potentially the downside of this ending up in the courts?
Yes, we talked to the Attorney General's office to make sure it would be compatible with all the concerns that might be had, and whether or not it would endanger the costs associated with the Every Student SIGS Act, and also whether or not the state of Iowa would be legally responsible if there's a change. As you, I'm sure, know, in the Iowa Constitution, it says that we cannot abridge a contract, but an RFP is not a contract. The actual legislature and the governor have the authority to make decisions for the people of Iowa, as long as the contract has not already been entered into.
Senator Shelgren, as it relates to the time frame of when this could be implemented, do you have a timeline? Has the University of Iowa provided you a timeline with when their test might clear peer review, be developed, and be fully implemented?
Senator McCoy, I realize you're reading from notes that happened probably before you read the amendment, so let me read the amendment information to you. The amendment requires a new assessment for English language arts, math, science assessments to be ready for July 1st, 18 of the school year. So there is a time frame on there with the expectation, and we've been assured that they will make that time frame.
But again, we don't know that they will make the time frame, and we don't know whether their test will meet the criteria when we know there is a test that is already meeting the criteria being used in various other states.
Well, what I can tell you is that you're making a lot of subjective statements about whether or not we believe the departments that we give a substantial amount of money to. I mean, you're talking about the Iowa testing at the University of Iowa, and I know that as a chamber, we give over $200 million a year, I think about $216 million a year to the University of Iowa, because they do such a phenomenal job. When they tell us something, we usually presume they know what they're talking about. So I would trust their opinion that they can do this.
Thank you, Senator Shelgren.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad Senator Shelgren trusts that the department will have this test ready. They've had 7 years to develop this test since 2011. They have not developed it. They have not done any core alignment. They have not changed anything about their current Iowa assessment test. They have not been through peer review, and we're to believe that they're going to get all of this done within a year's time, and I think that is overly optimistic. But I guess, that's my perspective. I think the amendment made this bill better. I'm glad we got a record on the amendment. This is still a bad bill. This bill is still taking the state in the wrong direction. It disrespects the task force work and the people that dedicated themselves to this cause and tried to improve what is being taught and try to determine how those measurements were being implemented. And so once again, I urge the body to not go down this road, to vote no on this, and to allow the national standard that is being used by other states that tests all of the Common Core curriculum and ensures that students get a fair shake and teachers get a fair break as it really truly measures what's being taught in the classroom. So that's my wish for this body today. And again, we'll remember these comments next year if the University of Iowa is not able to comply with your deadline. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the senator from Clinton, Senator Hart.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too rise in opposition to House File 2235. At a time when this legislature should be listening to teachers, this legislation sends a really bad message. And Senator Shelgren, the message from senators and representatives is that politicians know more about what works in the classroom than teachers who are in the classroom every day. Those concerns are not reflected in this bill, nor in the amendment. House File 2235 ignores the voices of educators. Teachers, principals, superintendents, other educators spent valuable time, energy, and expertise in a series of meetings, like Senator Quirmbach described, over 2 years, and their voices were ignored 100%. House File 2235 wasted the valuable time of educators. Educators left their classrooms and other job responsibilities to serve for hours on this task force. Money spent on substitutes, loss of time on other projects, meant fewer resources for students. House File 2235 jeopardizes future participation on task forces. Looking at this legislation, who in their right mind would want to serve on a task force in the future? Only to have that expertise and guidance completely ignored. Why would anyone want to do that? The disrespect shown to these task force members is unacceptable. If this bill is what legislators wanted and intended when developing a statewide assessment, you should have said that from the beginning, instead of asking these educators to participate in a fruitless exercise in frustration. Friends and colleagues, I am here in the Iowa State Senate supporting the voices of Iowa educators. Shouldn't we all be doing that? Please join me in voting no on House File 2235.
Seeing no further discussion, the chair recognizes Senator from Wapello for final remarks on House File 2235, as amended.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, colleagues. And I appreciate the conversation, so let me go ahead and see if I can clarify some things in this process. What this test is doing is it's replacing the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, a test that a lot of our children, in some cases some of our grandchildren, have taken in the state of Iowa in order to determine what their placement is with regards to a national standard or a state standard. And so we wanted to have something that was more up to date. We wanted to have something that we could track a little better. We wanted to have something that we could identify as a better test overall. And we've waited for quite a while to do that. In the meantime, in our delays, we continue to use outdated tests. Regarding some statements made about educators who spent their time on this, by the way, it's incredibly appreciated the amount of time that is spent by people on work groups. We have work groups who've worked on projects through the state of Iowa across the gambit. I know we just recently talked about a work group that was in dealing with complex needs and mental health. And that work group put together a package, and it wasn't taken in its complete package. I know that Senator Edler spent a tremendous amount of time on that bill, okay, to mold it into something that we could actually utilize to make sure it fit into what the law was. I know the House had to have some statements on that. I know that Representative Fry, Representative Lundgren spent a lot of time making sure that they could add to it also. And that was done in a way in order to make sure the bill was something that could be successful. It was in no way, and I don't believe intended to be, disrespect to anyone who's on those work groups. But we put through legislation that said that we wanted the cost of this to be important. This legislation says that the University of Iowa Testing Center is going to do this. It also saves the schools in the state of Iowa $9.3 million every single year that this test is used. And I totally agree that if there are teachers who have volunteered for this program who feel like they had to have a substitute teacher come in and cover for them while they were adding to this, I appreciate that. But if you want to take down the dollars for that, the time lost, maybe $5,000 or $10,000. The issue ends up being it is tremendously, I respect those teachers tremendously for adding to this conversation, for giving advice. But $9.3 million a year is important. The other thing I would say is that Senator Lofgren had an amendment earlier. Let me read to you some of the things this amendment deals with directly. We talked already about the fact it does have time frames in this, that the University of Iowa has committed to making the time frames, and I do trust them that they'll do that. But also, the amendment requires the new assessment to be aligned with the Iowa Common Core standards in both content and rigor, and provide a measure for student growth and meet the summative assessment requirements of Every Student Succeeds Act. The very act you're concerned with is in that amendment saying it's required. Beyond that, the amendment also requires an independent third-party review. I know you're concerned that that third-party review might slow things down, but it's important that the quality be checked by an outside area. I don't think we'd want to do anything that wouldn't have that in there. And so, yes, it might take a little bit longer to make sure a third party is comfortable with what we're doing. And the reason for that is we want them to determine the assessment is aligned. It measures student growth, and it meets assessment requirements of the Every Student Succeeds Act. These are important things, and they're in here. And I find it interesting that, yes, I trust the University of Iowa Test Center to do this. And it was only a couple years ago, Senator Hart, that when we had an economic development group, I remember a bill coming forth that was the Buy Iowa Act. Most of us in here had to vote, if we have been here for over 4 years, we had to vote that yes, we wanted to prioritize Iowa businesses. We wanted to make sure that when taxpayer money was spent, it was spent in Iowa. And this is a good thing. We spend $216 million a year to the University of Iowa because we trust them. And we hear all the time that we want to give them more money. Okay, this is an important aspect of it, because to me the best thing about this process is the University of Iowa is doing this. If we have concerns as legislators, it is a lot easier for us to go to the University of Iowa and say, we would like you to take into account some of the concerns we have about this testing process over some organization that's run out of Washington, D.C. that services over half the country. We'll get put on the list if we have a concern, but it won't be dealt with like the University of Iowa, in my belief, will deal with it. They will prioritize what's important to us. Both parties, both chambers, the executive branch, they'll work with us on this. I do trust that they'll do that. This is a good bill. It was made a lot better by the amendment. With that, that's my closing comments, and I want to ask my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you.
The senator from Wapello moves that House File 2235 as amended be read for the last time and placed on its passage. Those in favor of the motion say aye. Those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Secretary will read.
House File 2235, a bill for enacting statewide assessment of student progress for purposes of core academic indicators, including effective date provisions, being enacted by General Assembly, State of Iowa.
The senator from Wapello moves that the reading thus far be considered the last reading of the bill. Those in favor of the motion say aye. Those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Is the title agreed to? The title is agreed to. The question now is, shall the bill pass? Those in favor of the passage of House File 2235 will vote aye. Those opposed vote no. The Secretary will receive your vote. Senator Sinclair votes aye. Senator Brown votes aye. Senator Chapman votes aye. Senator Edler votes aye. Senator Breitbach votes aye. Senator Schultz votes aye. Senator Smith votes aye. Senator Kinney votes aye. Senator Taylor votes no. Senator Bertrand votes aye. Has every senator voted? Every senator has voted. The Secretary will close the voting system. The Secretary will lock the voting system and record your vote. The Senate will pay attention to the result of the roll call. Those voting aye, 39. Those voting no, 10. The bill having received the constitutional majority is declared to have passed the Senate, and the title was agreed to.